My name is Margaret Collins, and I am 68 years old, living in a quiet town just outside of Columbus, Ohio, in a house my husband and I built more than 30 years ago. For most of my life, I believed that if you gave your family everything, they would protect what mattered. But one quiet night, without anyone knowing I was there, I heard a sentence that changed the meaning of everything I thought I understood about trust, home, and the people I once called my own. This is not a story I ever planned to tell, but it is real, and it began with a single moment that I cannot forget. We're just using her until the house is ours. I heard it as clearly as if it had been said to my face, not whispered in the dark just beyond the kitchen doorway. It was 11:42 p.m. and I had come downstairs for a glass of water, moving slowly out of habit more than need, careful not to make the floorboards creak the way they used to when my husband was still alive and we would laugh about the house, settling like an old friend sighing in its sleep. But that night the house wasn't sighing. It was listening, and so was I. I stopped where the hallway met the living room, one hand resting lightly against the wall, my breath so quiet I could barely feel it in my chest. Emily's voice came first, soft, almost amused, like she was talking about something trivial, something already decided. Then Ryan's, lower, steady, certain. There was no anger in it, no urgency, just calm calculation. That was what made it land the way it did. Not like a blow, but like something final being set in place. I didn't step forward. I didn't clear my throat. I didn't let them know I was there. I stood in the dark and let the sentence settle into me, word by word, until it no longer sounded like a sentence at all, just a fact that had been waiting patiently for me to notice it. I had spent years believing that silence meant peace, that if I kept things steady, predictable, kind, the world inside these walls would stay gentle. That belief had carried me through my husband's funeral, through the quiet months that followed, through the phone call that told me my son wasn't coming home. It had carried me through the long stretch of evenings where the only sound in the house was the ticking of the clock above the stove. And it had carried me, without question, to the moment Emily showed up at my door again. She hadn't knocked right away that day. I remember seeing her through the front window first, standing on the porch with her arms folded tightly across her chest, like she was holding herself together. I opened the door before she could decide to leave. She looked thinner than I remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. When she said my name, her voice cracked just enough to make it real. She told me things hadn't worked out, that she needed somewhere to land, just for a little while. Ryan stood a few steps behind her, quiet, respectful, the kind of man who knew how to let someone else speak first. I didn't ask for details. I didn't set conditions. I stepped aside and told them to come in. It felt like the only thing that made sense. Emily had once been my daughter-in-law, but more than that, she had been part of the life my son built, and after he was gone, there weren't many pieces of that life left. Keeping her close felt, at the time, like keeping a part of him from disappearing completely. So I gave them the master bedroom without thinking twice. I moved my things into the smaller guest room down the hall. I started cooking for 3 again, setting the table the way I used to, even if they rarely sat down at the same time. In the mornings, I made coffee the way Emily liked it, with a little too much cream, and left it on the counter before she came downstairs. I told myself it was temporary, that people needed time. That kindness, real kindness, didn't keep score. There were small moments, even in those first weeks, that didn't sit quite right. Ryan would stand in the living room sometimes, hands in his pockets, looking around like he was measuring the place in ways I didn't understand. He once ran his fingers along the edge of the built-in bookshelf my husband had installed himself and said, "You could open this whole wall up, make it feel bigger." He smiled when he said it, like it was just an idea, nothing more. Emily laughed and agreed, talking about light, about space, about how houses like this had so much potential if you knew how to modernize them. I remember nodding, because it seemed easier than explaining that some things weren't meant to be opened up. Some things were built to hold. There were other moments, quieter ones. Emily asking one afternoon over tea if I had ever updated the paperwork on the house. Just curiosity, she said. Nothing serious. Ryan mentioning in passing that property values in the area had gone up a lot in the last few years. Little things. Harmless on their own. Easy to overlook when you want to believe the best in people. And I did want to believe that. I wanted to believe that opening my door had been the right thing, that the house my husband and I built together was still in some way a place where people could come back to themselves. Standing there in the dark that night, listening to them talk about me like I wasn't part of the equation at all, I felt something shift, not suddenly, not violently, but quietly, like a lock turning somewhere deep inside. The glass of water I had come for was still sitting untouched on the counter behind me. I didn't go back for it. I didn't need it anymore. I stayed where I was until their voices faded into something I could no longer make out, until the house returned to that familiar, hollow quiet. Then I turned, just as carefully as I had come down, and walked back up the stairs without making a sound. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. I felt something cleaner than that, something that didn't ask for explanation or apology. By the time I reached the top step, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. They thought they were waiting for me to give them something. They didn't realize I was the one who still owned everything that mattered. I did not sleep that night, not in any real sense of the word, but I lay in bed with my eyes open, watching the faint outline of the ceiling as the hours passed, listening to the house the way I used to listen for my son coming home late. The quiet shift of the front door, the careful steps so he would not wake me, and for a moment I almost expected to hear it again, that familiar rhythm, that reassurance that someone who belonged here was still moving through these rooms. But the house stayed still, and I understood why, because the people downstairs were not moving through it the way we once had. They were waiting inside it, waiting for something to end. And I had not realized until now that I was the thing they were waiting on, that my presence had become a timeline, not a person. And once that thought settled, everything else began to fall into place with a kind of quiet precision that left no room for doubt. I thought about the way Emily had stood on that porch months ago, the way her shoulders had curved inward as if she were carrying something heavy, and I had believed that weight was grief or fear or uncertainty, but now I saw something else in it, something I had missed because I wanted to see her as she used to be. As the young woman who had once sat at my kitchen table with my son, laughing over coffee, making plans that stretched far beyond this house. And I remembered the day she told me they were getting married, how my son had looked at her like she was the beginning of everything, and how I had welcomed her without hesitation, not because I had to, but because it felt natural, because family to me had never been something you measured or protected carefully. It was something you extended, something you trusted would hold. And after he was gone, after the accident took both him and my husband in a way that still did not feel entirely real, even years later, Emily had been one of the few threads left connecting me to that life. And when she drifted away, I told myself that was part of grief, that people did not always stay where the memories were too heavy. So when she came back, I did not question it. I saw it as a return, not an opportunity. I remember how quickly she settled in, how easily the routines shifted around her, and Ryan, the way the house adapted as if it had been waiting for more voices again. And I let that happen because it filled the silence in a way that felt almost like healing. But there had been moments, small and quiet, that I had chosen not to examine too closely. Like the afternoon I found Ryan going through the drawer in the hallway where I kept old documents, not rummaging exactly, but looking with a kind of interest that lingered a second too long. And when I asked if he needed something, he smiled and said he was just trying to find a pen, and I handed him one without another word. Or the evening Emily mentioned that houses in this neighbourhood rarely stayed in the same hands forever anymore, that people were always upgrading, moving, trading up for something newer, and she said it lightly, as if it were just conversation. But now I could hear the direction in it, the assumption, and I thought about the way they had slowly taken over spaces in the house, not by asking, but by using, the master bedroom becoming theirs, the living room rearranged to fit their preferences. The small changes that felt temporary at first, but gradually became permanent, and I had stepped around them, adjusted to them, because it seemed easier than pushing back, because I told myself that accommodating them was a form of care, that this was what you did for people who needed a place to land. But as the first light of morning began to come through the curtains, soft and pale against the walls, I sat up in bed and realized that nothing they had done was accidental, nothing was truly temporary. They had been settling in with a purpose, and I had been making space for it, believing I was offering shelter, when in reality I had been stepping aside, and that was when the last piece clicked into place, not with anger, not with regret, but with a clarity that felt almost steady, like something I could stand on. I was not confused anymore. I was not guessing. I knew exactly where I stood in their plans, and more importantly, I knew where they stood in mine. And for the first time since they had walked back into my life, I understood that kindness did not require me to disappear, that there was a difference between giving and being taken, and I had crossed that line without noticing. But now that I could see it, I was not going to pretend it was not there. By the time the clock in the hallway read 6:12 in the morning, I was already dressed, not in anything special, just the same soft grey sweater I had worn the day before. But there was something different in the way it sat on my shoulders, like it belonged to someone who had made up her mind, and I moved through the house quietly, the way I always had. But this time, not out of habit, out of intention. I passed the kitchen where the coffee machine blinked 6:15 in soft blue numbers waiting to be turned on, and I did not touch it. I passed the living room where the couch had been shifted 3 inches to the left a few weeks ago to suit Ryan's idea of better flow, and I noticed it in a way I had not allowed myself to before. Every adjustment, every small claim they had made on this space now stood out clearly, not as changes but as markers, like flags placed one at a time until the ground no longer felt like mine, and I walked past all of it without stopping, heading straight for the staircase that led to the attic, the one place in the house that had not been touched, not repurposed, not discussed because it was not visible and therefore not useful to them. The wooden steps creaked slightly under my weight, a familiar sound that once meant nothing, but now felt like a reminder that some parts of this house still remembered me. I reached the top and pulled the string that turned on the single bulb overhead, a soft yellow light filling the narrow space, dust catching in the air like it had been waiting to be seen again. And in the far corner, beneath a stack of old boxes and a folded blanket I had not used in years, sat the wooden chest, the same one my husband had insisted we keep everything important in, not because he was overly cautious, but because he believed in knowing exactly where things stood. I knelt down slowly, my knees protesting just enough to remind me of time, and lifted the lid, the hinges making a low, steady sound that echoed more than I expected. Inside, everything was exactly where I had left it, untouched, unchanged, waiting. I reached for the folder first, the one with the property documents, my fingers steady in a way I had not anticipated, and I opened it carefully, laying the papers out across the flat surface of the chest, one by one, the deed, the mortgage statement, the final documents we had signed years ago when the house became fully ours. And there it was, clear, unmistakable, my name, alone, printed in black ink that had not faded, that had not shifted, that had not been altered by time or by anyone else's intentions. I read it twice, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it settle into me fully. This house was not a shared assumption. It was not a future promise. It was a fact, and it had always been that way. I sat back slightly, letting that understanding move through me without resistance, and for the first time since the night before, I allowed myself a breath that reached all the way down into my chest, not shallow, not careful, but complete. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindictive. I felt aligned, like something that had been slightly off had returned to its proper place. I gathered the papers again, stacking them neatly, and set them back into the folder. But I did not close the chest right away. Instead, I reached for the envelope beneath it, the one with my husband's handwriting across the front, my name written in a way that was both familiar and distant now. I held it for a moment, considering whether to open it, whether I needed to, but I realized I already knew what it would say. Not the exact words, but the intention, the clarity he had always carried, the certainty that some decisions did not require permission or discussion. They required action. I placed the envelope back where it had been and closed the lid of the chest gently, the sound final but not heavy. When I stood up, I did not rush. I took a moment to look around the attic at the things we had kept, the things we had chosen not to throw away. And I understood something simple and undeniable. This house had been built with intention, with care, with a sense of permanence that was never meant to be handed over to someone waiting for the right moment. And as I turned off the light and made my way back down the stairs, I knew exactly what needed to happen next. Not because I was reacting, but because I was no longer willing to be part of something that had already decided I did not belong. And by the time I reached the bottom, the plan was not forming. It was already there, fully intact, waiting for me to follow through. At 7:03 in the morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I had finally decided to make, not out of routine, but because I wanted the house to feel the same one last time, the way it used to before every small shift had turned it into something else. And the sunlight came in through the window over the sink, soft and steady, catching the edge of the counter where I had once stood with my husband, talking about nothing important, just the day ahead. And for a moment I let that memory sit there, not to hold on to it, but to acknowledge it, because this place had been real long before it became someone else's plan. I heard movement upstairs around 7:28, a door closing, then footsteps, slow at first, then more certain, and I did not look up when Emily walked into the kitchen. She said good morning in that same familiar tone she had always used, light, almost careful, and I answered the same way, because nothing needed to change on the surface yet. She poured herself coffee, added too much cream, stirred it twice, just like always, and leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone. Ryan came down a few minutes later, his voice deeper in the quiet space, asking if we had more bread. I told him it was in the pantry, second shelf, left side, and he nodded, not quite looking at me, just reaching for what he needed. And for a few minutes, everything appeared exactly as it had the day before. The same small sounds, the same movements, the same shared space that was no longer truly shared. But I watched differently now, not as someone participating, but as someone observing something already in motion. Emily mentioned a listing she had seen online, a house about 15 miles away that had sold above asking price. She said it casually, like a passing comment. But Ryan responded with interest, asking what the square footage was, what the lot size looked like, whether the updates were recent, and I listened without reacting, noting the way they spoke about property as if it were a language they both understood, a language that did not include me. Emily glanced at me once and said, almost as an afterthought, places like this are getting harder to find. And I nodded slowly, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just letting the sentence exist without giving it anything back, because I understood now that every word carried direction, every conversation pointed somewhere, and I was no longer standing in the path without realizing it. After breakfast, they moved on with their day. Emily took a call in the living room, her voice shifting into something brighter, more performative, while Ryan stepped outside, pacing slowly along the front yard, looking out toward the street like he was measuring distance, space, possibility, and I remained where I was for a moment longer, finishing my coffee down to the last sip, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to complete something simple before beginning something irreversible. At 8:17, I stood up, rinsed the cup, and placed it carefully in the sink, aligning it the way I always had, even though no one else noticed those small details anymore. Then I walked to the hallway and picked up the phone, not my cell, but the landline mounted on the wall, the one I'd kept out of habit, out of preference, out of a quiet resistance to letting everything become too fast, too easy to ignore. I dialed a number I had not used in over a year. Daniel Brooks, the real estate agent who had helped a neighbour sell her home quietly, without open houses, without signs in the yard, without attention. He answered on the third ring, his voice steady, professional, the kind of voice that did not ask unnecessary questions. I told him my name, reminded him briefly where I lived, and then I said, as clearly as I could, I would like to sell my house, quickly and privately. There was a pause, not hesitation, just calculation. Then he asked one question, are you looking for a traditional listing or something off-market? And I answered, without needing to think, off-market cash buyer, as soon as possible. He did not ask why. He did not suggest alternatives. He simply said he would come by later that morning to take a look, discreetly. And I thanked him, not out of politeness, but because he understood the kind of transaction this needed to be. When I hung up the phone, I stood there for a moment, the quiet settling around me again. But it felt different now, not empty, not waiting, but aligned with something that was already moving forward. I did not announce what I had done. I did not call out to Emily or Ryan. I did not give them the opportunity to respond to something they had already set in motion themselves. Instead, I walked back into the kitchen, wiped down the counter where a small ring of coffee had been left behind, and moved through the rest of the morning the same way I always had. Calm, measured, present, because nothing on the surface needed to change for everything underneath to already be decided. Daniel arrived at exactly 10:02 that morning, not a minute earlier, not a minute late, his car pulling into the driveway without drawing attention, no signage, no branding on the doors, just a quiet presence that matched the kind of transaction I had asked for. I met him at the front door before he had a chance to knock, and for a brief moment, standing there with the sunlight behind him, I wondered if he could see anything different in me. If there was any visible shift from the woman who had once opened this same door without question. But if he noticed, he did not say it. He introduced himself with a firm but respectful tone, stepped inside and paused just long enough to take in the space without making it feel like an inspection. I guided him through the house slowly, not as a tour, but as a confirmation. The kitchen first, then the living room, the hallway, the bedrooms, each space carrying a version of itself that existed long before it became part of someone else's plan. Emily was in the living room when we passed through, her voice lowering slightly as she ended a phone call, her eyes moving between me and Daniel. With a flicker of confusion, she tried to smooth over with a polite smile. I introduced him simply as someone I needed to speak with about the house. Nothing more, nothing less. She nodded. But I could see the question forming behind her expression, the kind that waits for a clearer answer. Ryan was not inside, still somewhere outside, or perhaps already gone. And that absence made things easier, quieter, less complicated. Daniel did not linger in any one room, but I noticed the way his eyes moved, measuring without being obvious, calculating without being intrusive. When we reached the back door that opened onto the small yard, he stepped out for a moment, looked at the space, the fence line, the way the sunlight fell across the grass, and nodded once, almost to himself. When we returned to the kitchen, he set a folder down on the table and spoke in a low, even voice, explaining what he could do, how quickly this could move, what kind of buyer he had in mind. An older couple, he said, looking to downsize, financially ready, no need for financing contingencies, no interest in drawn-out negotiations. I listened without interrupting. Not because I had no questions, but because I already knew the answer I was looking for. And when he finished, I said only one thing. I want this done before the end of the week. He did not hesitate. He simply nodded and said it was possible that he would make a call as soon as he left, that we could have an offer in hand within 48 hours if everything aligned. And I felt that same steady alignment settle in again, not rushed, not pressured, just moving forward with purpose. Emily stepped into the kitchen just as Daniel was gathering his folder, her tone light but edged with curiosity as she asked if everything was all right, if there was something she needed to know. I turned to her and met her eyes fully, not with accusation, not with explanation, just with clarity. And I said, everything is exactly as it needs to be. She held my gaze for a second longer than usual, as if trying to read something beneath the surface, but there was nothing there for her to take hold of, nothing that gave away what had already been set in motion. Daniel left a few minutes later, his car pulling away just as quietly as it had arrived, and the house returned to its familiar stillness. But it no longer felt uncertain, it felt decided. The rest of the day unfolded without disruption. Emily moved through her routine, checking her phone, making calls, occasionally glancing in my direction with that same unspoken question lingering just out of reach. And I moved through mine, folding laundry, organising drawers, touching things not because I needed to pack them, but because I needed to choose what still mattered and what did not. By the time the sun began to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the living room floor, I knew exactly what I would take with me and what I would leave behind. And more importantly, I knew that none of it, not the furniture, not the walls, not even the memories tied to specific rooms, defined what was mine. Because what was mine had never been the house itself. It had been the decision to build it, to care for it, and now to let it go on my terms. And that was something no one had accounted for. Not Emily, not Ryan, and not the version of me they thought they understood. The call came the next day at 9:18 in the morning, while I was standing at the sink, rinsing a plate I had not really used, just moved food around on to keep the routine intact, and I let it ring once before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to meet it on my terms. Daniel's voice was the same as before, steady, direct. He told me he had found the right buyers, a retired couple from out of state, financially prepared, no financing delays, no contingencies that would slow things down. They had been looking for something exactly like this, a property with character, with space, something that had not been stripped down and rebuilt into something unrecognisable. He said they were ready to move forward immediately, that they could make a full cash offer by the afternoon if I agreed. I did not ask the price right away, not because it did not matter, but because the decision had already been made before numbers entered the conversation. When I finally asked, he gave me a figure that was fair, more than fair. But what mattered more was the simplicity of it, the absence of negotiation, the absence of back and forth, just a clear path from one point to the next. I said yes, without needing time to consider, and he told me he would have the paperwork prepared within hours, that we could sign as soon as I was ready. When I hung up the phone, I stood there for a moment longer, the sound of the water still running, steady and unchanged, and I turned it off, dried my hands, and walked into the living room where Emily was sitting on the couch, her phone in her hand, her attention divided between the screen and whatever thoughts had been building since yesterday. She looked up when I entered, her expression open but searching, as if she had been waiting for something to shift into focus. I sat down across from her, not too close, not distant, just enough space to keep things clear, and for a second neither of us spoke. Then she asked, in that careful tone she had started using more often, "Is everything okay?" And I met her eyes, not avoiding, not pressing, just present, and I said yes. Nothing more, nothing less. Because anything beyond that would have invited a conversation that no longer belonged to her. She nodded slowly. But I could see the question still there, unresolved, and she let it go, or at least pretended to. The rest of the morning passed without interruption. Ryan came and went, his movements slightly sharper than usual, his attention shifting between his phone and the house in a way that suggested he was always calculating something just beyond reach. But neither of them knew what had already been set in motion. By 1:32 in the afternoon, Daniel arrived again, this time with a folder that felt heavier, more defined, the kind of weight that comes with finality. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I had spent years serving meals, sharing conversations, holding together a version of family that no longer existed. And he walked me through each page, each document, each line that confirmed what I already understood. The sale agreement, the transfer details, the timeline, everything structured to move quickly, cleanly, without room for interference. I read every word, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to witness it fully. And when it was time to sign, my hand did not hesitate. The pen moved steadily across the page, my name forming exactly as it always had, unchanged, consistent, undeniable. Daniel gathered the papers when I was finished, his movements efficient but respectful, and he told me the buyers would finalise everything within 48 hours, that possession would transfer immediately after. No delays, no extensions, just a clear end point. I thanked him, not with emotion, but with acknowledgement. And when he left, the house felt different, not emptier, not lighter, just no longer mine in the way it had been that morning, and yet somehow more mine than it had been in months. Because for the first time since Emily had walked back through that front door, every decision being made within these walls belonged entirely to me. And there was a quiet strength in that, something that did not need to be spoken or defended, something that simply existed, steady and complete. And as I stood there, looking out the window toward the yard that would soon belong to someone else, I realised that letting go was not the same as losing. It was the final step in reclaiming something I had almost given away without realising it. By the time the papers were finalised, it was already late afternoon, around 4:26, and the light coming through the windows had shifted into that softer tone that made everything look a little more distant than it actually was. I moved through the house slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to see it clearly one last time, not as something I was losing, but as something I had already decided to leave behind. I did not pack the way people usually do. There were no boxes stacked in corners, no piles of things waiting to be sorted. I chose only what mattered, the documents first, placed carefully into a leather folder I had not used in years, then a small wooden frame with a photograph of my husband and my son standing on the front porch, both of them smiling in a way that belonged to a different version of this house, one that no longer needed to be preserved in walls or furniture. I left everything else where it was, the dishes in the cabinets, the books on the shelves, even the old quilt, folded at the end of the guest bed, because none of those things defined what I was taking with me. I moved into the kitchen around 5:03, the same space where so many ordinary moments had once felt meaningful, and I stood at the counter for a moment, looking at the surface that had held so many conversations, so many quiet routines. And then I reached for a sheet of stationery from the drawer, the one I had kept for letters I rarely wrote anymore. I sat down at the table and began to write. Not quickly, not slowly, just steadily. The words coming without hesitation, because they did not need to convince anyone of anything. They only needed to be true. I did not accuse, I did not explain. I did not ask questions that no longer required answers. I wrote simply that the house had been sold, that ownership had transferred, that they would be contacted with the details regarding their departure, and that what they had been waiting for had never belonged to them. I signed my name at the bottom, the same way I had signed the documents earlier, consistent, unchanged, and I folded the paper once, placing it neatly in the centre of the table where it would be seen without effort, without confusion. By 5:27, I had already taken my coat from the closet, the same coat I wore on colder mornings when I needed something familiar around my shoulders, and I paused at the front door, my hand resting lightly on the handle, not because I was hesitating, but because I was recognising the moment for what it was. A transition that did not require ceremony or farewell. Just movement. I opened the door and stepped outside, the air cooler than it had been earlier, carrying that quiet stillness that comes at the end of the day. My car was parked exactly where it had been, unchanged, waiting, and I placed the folder and the frame carefully on the passenger seat before getting in. I did not look back at the house right away, not out of avoidance, but because I did not need to confirm anything that had already been decided. When I finally did glance in the rearview mirror as I pulled away at 5:32, the house looked the same as it always had, steady, unmoving, holding everything that was no longer mine to carry. And as I drove down the street, the distance between me and that place did not feel like loss. It felt like clarity, like the final step in something that had already been set in motion long before I heard the words that changed everything. And for the first time in a long time, there was nothing behind me that required my return. At 9:06 the next morning, my phone began to vibrate on the small table beside the bed, the same steady pattern repeating over and over, but I did not reach for it right away. I sat up slowly, letting the quiet of the room settle around me, the unfamiliar stillness of a place that did not carry their voices, their movements, their assumptions, And when I finally looked at the screen, there were already 6 missed calls, all from Emily, followed by a message that simply read, "Where are you?" And then another, seconds later, "What is this about the house?" I set the phone down again without responding, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left to clarify. Everything they needed to know was already waiting for them in that kitchen, in that letter, in the absence they had not anticipated. By 9:14, the calls started again, this time from Ryan, his name appearing in the same place hers been, the repetition almost mechanical, as if pressing the call button enough times might change what had already happened. I let it ring, then stop, then ring again until the silence returned, and I stood, moving toward the window where the morning light reflected off the surface of the lake, just beyond the trees, steady, undisturbed, the kind of view that did not ask for anything in return, at 9:27. A message came through from Daniel, brief and precise, confirming that the buyers had taken possession, that all documentation had been filed, that the transition was complete. And I read it once, then set the phone aside again, not needing to revisit it, because I already knew, around 9:42, the call stopped, replaced by a single voicemail, and after a moment I pressed play. Emily's voice filled the room, not the controlled, careful tone she had used in the house, but something sharper, uneven. "Margaret, you need to call me back. There are people here, they are saying we have to leave, that the house is not ours, that you sold it, this has to be some kind of mistake." There was a pause, a shift, then her voice again, lower now, almost pleading. "Please, just tell me what is going on." The message ended without resolution, and I did not replay it. I did not need to hear the confusion more than once, because I had already heard the certainty that came before it. Later that morning, a second voicemail arrived, this one from Ryan, his tone controlled but strained. "We found your note. We read it. But this is not how things are supposed to work. You cannot just do this without talking to us. We have been living there. We have been taking care of things." He stopped for a moment, as if searching for the right words, then added, "You need to fix this." I listened without reaction, not because I was indifferent, but because there was nothing in his words that required a response. By noon, the messages shifted again, less structured, more urgent, fragments of explanation, attempts to reframe what had already been said. "We did not mean it like that. You misunderstood. We were just talking." Each message carrying less certainty than the one before, until they began to repeat themselves, circling the same point without landing anywhere solid. I imagined the scene without needing to see it, the unfamiliar car in the driveway, the new owners standing where I once had, calm, assured, the kind of presence that does not need to argue because it already belongs. Emily and Ryan trying to explain something that no longer held weight, their words meeting the reality of signed documents, of legal transfer, of decisions made without them. And for the first time, they were the ones standing in a space that no longer recognized them. I did not take satisfaction in that, not in the way people might expect. There was no sense of victory, no need to witness their reaction, because what had mattered had already been done, and what followed was simply the natural result of choices they had believed would never be challenged. As the afternoon settled into a quieter rhythm, the calls stopped completely, the silence returning in a way that felt different now, not heavy, not uncertain, but resolved. And I sat by the window again, watching the light shift across the water, understanding something simple and complete. They had believed they were waiting for the right moment to take something from me, but what they had not understood was that I had already chosen the moment to leave, and in doing so, I had taken back everything that had ever truly been mine. It has been just over a year since that morning, and the lake outside my window looks different depending on the time of day, sometimes still and reflective like glass, sometimes restless with small ripples that catch the light in a way that makes everything seem in motion, but it has never once felt uncertain. And I suppose that is what I noticed first when I came here. Not the quiet, not the distance from everything I left behind, but the absence of that underlying tension I had grown so used to that I no longer recognized it as something separate from myself. My days are simple now in a way that feels intentional rather than empty. I wake up early, usually before the sun fully rises, make my tea the same way I always have, and sit on the small porch wrapped in a light sweater even in warmer months, because there is something grounding in the ritual of it. Something that reminds me that not everything needs to change in order for everything to become different. I planted a small garden along the side of the cabin in early spring, nothing elaborate, just a few rows of flowers I remembered my husband liking, soft colours, nothing too structured, and I tend to tend to them in the afternoons, not because they require constant attention, but because the act itself feels steady, like placing something back into the ground and trusting it to grow without interference. There are people here, of course, neighbours I pass occasionally, a man who lives a few cabins down, who always nods when he sees me, never asking questions, never offering more than what is appropriate. And I have come to appreciate that kind of presence, something that exists without expectation, without the need to define itself in relation to me. I do not check my phone as often as I used to, not because I am avoiding anything, but because there is nothing left that requires my immediate response. The calls stopped months ago, the messages faded into silence, and whatever version of the story Emily and Ryan chose to tell after that has no place here, not in the way I live now. Sometimes when I am out in town, someone will mention the house, the way it sold quickly, the new couple who moved in, how they restored certain parts of it instead of changing everything, and I listen politely, nodding when appropriate, but I do not add to the conversation, because the house no longer belongs to my story in the way people expect it to. It was never just a structure, and it was never something that could be taken simply because someone decided to wait long enough. It was a decision, and I carried that decision with me when I left. I keep the photograph I took with me on a small shelf near the window, the one of my husband and my son standing on the porch. And sometimes I look at it, not with longing, not with regret, but with recognition. They were part of a life that was real, that mattered, that shaped everything that came after. But they were never meant to anchor me to a place where I no longer belonged. And I think that is what I understand most clearly now, that silence does not mean surrender, that stepping away is not the same as giving up. It is a choice, a deliberate movement towards something that does not require explanation. And when I think back to that night, to the words I heard spoken so casually in a house I had once believed was safe, I do not feel anger. I do not even feel betrayal in the way I once might have. I feel something far more certain than that. I feel the quiet knowledge that I was never what they thought I was. I was not something waiting to be replaced, not something meant to be outgrown or moved aside. I was the one who chose when to open the door, and more importantly, I was the one who chose when to close it. And there is a kind of peace in that decision that does not fade with time. It settles, it remains, it becomes part of the way you move forward, steady and unshaken, no longer waiting for anyone to decide your place for you.